Hello, if you're an English language A-level student and you're interested in phonological change, i.e. how pronunciation has changed diachronically over time, then this is the right video for you. Let's start with a little bit of early modern English. I'm going to give you a passage from a Shakespeare play, and I'm going to read it aloud in a way that it would have sounded in 1600. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling Seine. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the part of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Now, the big thing that you should be noticing there is its rhoticity, those doggy R sounds that we've got. And we know that this was pronounced in this way from various things. We have writers who have been writing about the sounds of English in the early 17th century. We have Ben Jonson, the famous playwright, who calls the R the doggy R. We also have the evidence from spellings of the time. Remember, in 1600, there wasn't such a thing as standardized spelling, so people would be spelling things in the way that they sounded. So there's another example in another Shakespeare play where the word film is spelled P-H-I-L-O-M-E, film. Okay, so that gives us a bit of an indication as to how it would have sounded. We've also got things like rhyming patterns as well. So in the absence of having any recorded information, what you can look at is kind of like the ends of lines in rhyming couplets. And, you know, if you have enough data on your hands, then you can make some pretty good educated guesses about what those sounds would have sounded like. So this might surprise you, the rhoticity of what we're going on here. So we've got words like warlike, which here is spoken as warlike, like that. So we've got a kind of foregrounded R sound after a vowel that strikes us today as a little bit different. To us, it sounds a little bit pirate-like, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like a very strong, exaggerated West Country kind of accent. And of course, this is the kind of accent that went across in the 17th century with the settlers who were religious nonconformists who were wanting to escape oppression in England. And so they sailed across to the States in order to set up new communities across there. And they took with them their pronunciation patterns. And really, it's the kind of the bedrock of the American rhotic standard pronunciation. Okay, so I've just used the term there, standard pronunciation. That's a bit of a misnomer, actually, because there isn't such a thing as standard pronunciation. We have standard spelling, of course. We have rule books that lay down the rules of grammar. But in terms of people's pronunciation, there is an inherent variability in there. So people in different parts of the country will be pronouncing things in different ways. Take this word S-C-O-N-E, for example. How do you say that word? Is it scone, with that kind of flat vowel sound that you'd associate with the north of England? Or do you say scone, with a diphthong sound in the middle in that vowel? So you'd associate that with southern English pronunciation. So whilst we can all agree upon the spelling, people have often quite strong feelings about which is the right and the wrong pronunciation. There is no such thing as standardized pronunciation. Okay, let's look at some of the processes of how English phonology has changed over the centuries then. Let's remind you about GVS. This is the Great Vowel Shift. So this is this phonological change that linguists have noticed that happened somewhere between 1400 and 1600. A significant shift in pronunciation. And in this shift, the long vowels of Middle English, i.e. medieval times English, they changed significantly. This is called the Great Vowel Shift. So you take a modern word like to, the preposition, and in 1400 that would have been pronounced toe. Modern English wife, Middle English pronunciation, weef. And modern English mouse, Middle English pronunciation, moose. So the best way to do it is to think about some Scottish pronunciations, and those are a bit similar to how English would have sounded in those days. So as we've said in a previous lesson, one of the reasons why English spelling is so bonkers is because the sounds of the language have changed, but the spellings have fossilized. So conventions have grown up that you spell a certain word in a certain kind of way, and then of course the pronunciation has changed over time. Okay, so we've got GVS as a good example of phonological change. I'm going to talk you through some other changes in phonology. Think about long and short vowels. I've just talked about scone and scone. Well, between 1700 and 1900, the long R sound in words, and I'm going to pronounce this in RP, path, that came to be used in southern parts of Britain. So before this, it would have been pronounced in its shorter form as it is in the northern and midland accents. Okay, so this kind of longer vowel sound is associated also with RP as well, received pronunciation, and you might say has a more of a status to it as well. So there's been a difference in the way that people have pronounced vowels over time, and that includes the schwa. Now the schwa is an unstressed sound. When we represent it using the IPA, it's an upside down E. And in current English, the schwa is a general vowel sound that we use instead of fully pronouncing the vowel. So the thing is, it's become more common. It's become more common in everyday speech than it used to be, even in RP. So take a word like A-B-O-U-T, we tend to say about. So that first vowel, listen to it, that's the schwa sound. Well, linguists think that some centuries ago, it was pronounced about. So the A sound was like that ash, that flat ash vowel. Similarly, take the word B-A-L-A-N-C-E, balance. Okay, that second vowel sound, again, it's that it's the schwa sound, an unstressed vowel sound. And we pronounce it like that rather than saying balance, which may strike people as being slightly odd. So we have this kind of all-purpose schwa, and it rears its ugly head in most words that you pronounce. Consonants, it's not just vowels that have changed, consonants have changed too. And for example, before the 19th century, ing, so this is the velar nasal phoneme that you get on the end of progressive aspect verbs like walking, right? So ing was generally pronounced in, walking, even by the middle and the upper classes. So shooting, fishing, hunting, in the early 19th century, this was very much kind of associated with aristocratic talk, which is interesting because it kind of is directly opposite to the findings of linguists like Peter Trudgill, who in the 70s went around Norwich and discovered that there was a very close link between people's social class and whether they were pronouncing the ing velar nasal sound or whether they were dropping that or rather substituting it for an N sound. And he found that you could map onto, like, the people who are, pronouncing it as walk-in rather than walking, they're very much related to working class speakers, whereas the middle classes tend to be using that velar nasal sound. So it's almost like changed completely round from the 19th century when the sound was the kind of general sound, particularly by aristocrats. The other phenomenon of phonological change, TH fronting. So this is the idea that you replace that fricative sound with a f sound, as in 1, 2, 3, rather than 1, 2, 3. And this is very much a feature of estuary English. It's called TH fronting. There's a little bit of an explanation about it in the AQA textbook on page 162, because there's been some research done by a couple of linguists in the 1990s called Folks and Doherty. So you can read about it there. And their contention is that this is one of these features of estuary English that's actually spread throughout the country. So it started off as a kind of Cockney feature in the London area, then it spread to the Thames estuary, to places like Reading and Milton Keynes, and then over time it drifted across the country as a kind of levelling kind of effect. So that's called TH fronting, and that's an interesting phonological pattern that's happened in the last 50 years. Some more phonological changes. The textbook talks about assimilation. So this is the idea where if you've got sounds that are adjacent to each other, they become more similar. Now, this can be like when you've got two separate words. So 10 pounds, for example. Say the word 10 pounds, the word's 10 pounds, and you're more likely to be saying 10 pounds when you say it quickly. So it's interesting, isn't it? That nasal phoneme at the end of 10, right, sort of morphs into an sound. Okay, now that doesn't usually make a permanent change to the way that we pronounce 10 in all sorts of different situations, But that kind of ease of articulation, it's called assimilation, happens in individual words. So you take a word like the RP handbag, and I wonder how many of you pronounce it in that carefully articulated way, handbag, and how many of you say handbag. Okay, so in which case that consonant cluster there has been reduced, and again that nasal sound and that plosive Dutch sound has been reduced to a handbag. So this is about ease of articulation. It's the idea of, we speak quickly. Linguists say that on average we speak something like 3 words per second, and in order to be efficient, therefore, we are bound to be clipping off certain words. Okay, as is demonstrated by this sentence here. George banged the drum hard as he marched through the town. If you slow that down and listen to yourself saying that, you'll see that you are omitting those ed inflectional endings of the past tense. George banged the drum hard as he marched through the town. It doesn't bother us in terms of the meaning. It doesn't change the meaning in any way, because we can work out from the meaning that it must be the past tense. Okay, now is this sloppy or lazy speech? Here you could apply Jean Aitchison's metaphors, where she characterizes people who complain about language change with the metaphors, the spoon, the damp spoon syndrome. So this is the idea we talked about in a previous lesson, where people are inherently lazy, and rather than bothering to articulate individual sounds, what they're doing is they're missing out individual letters because they can't be bothered to do it. So it's that kind of sloppy. But a linguist would say, well, actually, this happens all the time, this kind of omission. What it does, it enables the speakers to speak more fluently and look at particular words like whistle, for example, W-H-I-S-T-L-E, or thistle. We accept the omission of the T there without question. Another good example is the word Hanecker, right, which is the Old English form of it's a pain in the Hanecker. And that again shows the loss over time of sounds. In this case, it's the initial H sound and the final schwa sound. Okay, now another phonological aspect that has got people agitated is uptalk. This is high-rising terminals. So this is upspeak. It's when intonation rises. Now, usually we rise in our intonation at the end of when we're asking a question, don't we? Like that, going up. But with uptalk, intonation rises when you're making a statement, like that. Now, at first, uptalk appeared to be a feature of teenage speech, like I'm doing now, but now it's found in a wider range of age groups. And some linguists say it's used. Now, some linguists say, well, it's a good way of showing that you're not too dogmatic, you're tentative in your viewpoints, and therefore it's a good way of converging with other people because you're not being overly bossy and certain. Okay, so that's uptalk. Some people think that it originates from Australian soaps like Neighbours and Home and Away from the 1980s. Other people say, well, it's a Californian trait. It's Valley Girls in California in the 70s and 80s who are doing this uptalk. A lot of people get hot under the collar about it, and they have strong feelings that somehow it's bad for the language. Why does pronunciation change? Well, social factors affect pronunciation. Think about it when you go for a job interview, for example, in a posh office, then you are likely to do upwards convergence. So your pronunciation is not some kind of fixed entity. It's liable to change, and you are liable to converge or diverge depending on the situation that you're in. Other languages have an impact on pronunciation. If you think about Old English, the stress in Old English was usually on the initial syllable. French came in, all those words came into the language, something like 10,000 of them during the Middle English period. And French would have a different stress pattern. And often in polysyllabic words anyway, French words have a stress on the second syllable, so important, like that. So the stress syllables have changed. So the main point is that other languages, whether it be Old Norse, Viking, or whether it be Norman French, they have had an impact on pronunciation. And of course, you can link in with American English as well, with its stress on different syllables. Take this word B-A-L-L-E-T. How do you say that? Is it ballet or is it ballet? Okay, so I'm noticing a tendency amongst young people to pronounce it things like ballet, in which case it's the Americanized version that you're hearing. And then, of course, the media can influence pronunciation. The BBC's got a pronunciation unit, so broadcasters are guided on how to pronounce words. So this is to make sure that the presenters are pretty consistent in the way that they say words. It's usually, like foreign words, like proper nouns. But viewers then often copy the pronunciation of these unfamiliar or foreign words, and they become kind of like the standard pronunciation. Let's talk about RP. RP is the received pronunciation, once seen as the standard English accent. Sometimes it's given the misnomer Queen's English. The thing about it, it's a prestige accent. It's associated with good standing in society, and it's a sign of demonstrating good education, in inverted commas. And really, it emerged in the 20th century. You might think, well, it's been around for centuries and centuries, but it hasn't. It emerged in the early 20th century, and its emergence really led to regional accents being seen as socially inferior. Okay, and the big thing was it was adopted by the BBC. So the BBC established by Lord Reith in 1922, and they wanted this accent that they thought everybody could understand and sounded authoritative. So, and this added to its prestige because obviously the news and the public broadcasts, they were in RP, and so it became its accent of authority. So it's sometimes called the BBC English. But there have been changes, haven't they? From the middle of the 20th century, there have been changes to RP. One of my students, for example, has done a language investigation into how the language of the Queen has changed over time. And she's heard that it's moved a little bit from this very marked RP, where you've got words like hand, pronounced by the Queen in the 1950s as hand, and often, pronounced as often, and tissue, pronounced as tissue, like that. So there has been a bit of a shift in pronunciation, not only of the Queen, but society at large. And there's been more a kind of egalitarian drift where working class teenagers in the 1960s started going to university in large numbers for the first time. And then you've got the emergence of celebrities who speak with regional accents. And therefore, RP kind of loses some of its desirability. It's no longer considered absolutely necessary that if you are vying to be in a position of power, then you need to be adopting this received pronunciation. RP and estuary English is an interesting area to look at. So what I'm saying is marked RP is toned down, and in fact it's rarely heard these days. You might only find minor members of the aristocracy who are actually using this marked RP. And quite often you're going to be hearing in the media and in public like estuary English. So this is the English of people like Jamie Oliver and Russell Brand and Gervais, what's his name? And it has its roots in the Thames estuary in London. And it's got many features of the Cockney accent, but it's a kind of watered down Cockney accent. So what you're going to get is dropping of H's at the beginning of words. So instead of the word hit, you've got it. And you're going to get this TH fronting, which we've mentioned before. So this is pronounced in TH digraphs as Fs. So tooth becomes tooth. And then, of course, you've got the famous glottal stop. So estuary speakers will use a glottal stop. So instead of the t phonemes, those plosive phonemes in the medial position of that word bottle, you're going to hear bottle instead. Okay, and in the words of David Crystal, he's seeing this as a confluence between working class people in the 1980s who are moving up the social ladder, and therefore their language is becoming closer to RP. And then this kind of downward convergence you've got of educated people who are trying to tone down their RP way of sounding so they sound more kind of democratic. Okay, so it's quite linked in. I won't play you the Jamie Oliver video. I've got that on a different video, actually. What I will play you, if I can, is this bit of, it's a 1943 public information video about the history of the English language. Okay, and it's quite interesting as a demonstration of how BBC English would have sounded in the 1940s. And here's the opening to it. So just have a read of this and then have a listen to how it comes across.
Part of a small island off the west coast of Europe. Yet English is the spoken language, or else an official language, in all these parts of the world. It is in fact a world language. Where did it start? Somewhere between South Russia near the Black Sea and the Baltic, several thousand years ago.
Okay, so you can hear this marked RP. England, part of a small island off the west coast of Europe. And if you focus in on the R sound there, you can see it's slightly rolled, isn't it? Europe, like that. And later on, when it comes to talk about the different countries, I'll just play this bit.
This was the home of a group of languages we now call Indo-European. From here, they have spread all over Europe and into Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Australasia.
Okay, so America, like that. So that R, the slightly rolled rhotic sound in the middle of a word like America. And you've also got the very clipped, shortened vowel sounds of America, Africa, and Australasia, like that. So the pronunciation sort of a big stress that's being put on the short vowel sounds at the ends of those particular words. Okay, so that it's an interesting accent to listen to, and what's fascinating about it is how really when you use marked RP now, it's only very used to parody and to mock, and it's very difficult to actually use a marked RP accent in a way that is to be taken seriously. Okay, so it's a good demonstration of how phonology has changed. Okay, so if you've been paying attention, then you should be able to answer some of these questions. That first question applies to a David Crystal video that if you'd been in my class, I would have shown you, where he goes to the globe and he talks about the original pronunciation, i.e. the things that we were talking about at the beginning of this video. So how did the pronunciation of English shift significantly between 1400 and 1600? Give 2 examples. Explain 6 processes or features of phonological change over time, and give 3 reasons why English pronunciation has changed over time. Okay, so if you want a challenge for yourself, stop the video there and make notes in answer to those 4 questions. Here's another thing that I would get my students to do in class. So write a poem in rhyming couplets explaining how and why English pronunciation has changed. Must be at least 12 lines long. Now there's a challenge for you. So it's a handy revision tool, and your job is to kind of demonstrate your knowledge about phonological change, but write it in rhyming couplets. There's an example. I here present some information on changes in pronunciation, starting with the vowel shift when R and E began to drift. That's what you're doing. Have a go. Okay, now the other thing I want to show you is a sort of the beginnings of a discourses article. Remember, on the AQA paper 2, you've got an essay question that you're doing in section A. In section B, you're getting a couple of articles, often written by journalists, in which they're presenting linguistic elements. And 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was, there was one of the questions, or 2 of the articles rather, were about up talk. Okay, so let's look at the way that the journalist is using language here to present information and to make you think and feel about up talk. The unstoppable march of the upward inflection. So notice how it's putting a question mark on the end there in order to demonstrate what this linguistic feature is all about. We've got a kind of a pre-modifying adjective there, which kind of implies that you want to prevent it. So it's slightly pejorative because it's creating the impression that it's something that should be stopped. March is from the semantic field of conflict and war as well. So as you often get in new forms of language, the discourse that's used is often not very favourable. Okay, so there's that should sort of pique your interest. It's quite an interesting headline. Then you've got your byline, whether it's called the upward inflection, high rising terminal, or simply up talk. The habit of making statements sound like questions is a genuine linguistic mystery, writes Chris Stokel-Walker. So it's a good byline because it's giving you synonyms for upward inflection. It's telling you, you might have heard of it being described in all sorts of different ways. And here are 3 noun phrases that basically describe the same phenomenon. And it's whetting our appetite because it's setting up a linguistic mystery. So the detectives amongst us will think, I want to read this article and find out about where this upward inflection comes from. The habit of ending statements with a stress that makes them sound a bit like questions is one that winds many people up. Straight away in that first sentence there, you've got the feeling that, language, attitudes to language is a kind of supercharged area where people get hot under the collar and have very strong opinions. Bishop Lowth wouldn't approve, so this is the 18th century grammarian Bishop Lowth, he wouldn't approve of putting a preposition at the end of the word, and he probably wouldn't approve of that kind of prepositional verb winds people up, so quite a colloquial way of expressing themselves. But this is what articles do, or rather journalists in articles, they try and give a kind of direct, immediate opening, don't they? So that you're not off put. After all, you're going to be reading an article here about an abstract concept of language. So you've got to start in quite a dramatic way in order to grab people's attention. Surveys have suggested bosses dislike it. Stephen Fry admitted on the TV show Rumour One that he hated it. Numerous older people have picked up numerous younger people on their use of it. So notice the use of the short sentences here that give you, it's like a rule of three that we've got here. And the overall feeling that we've got by the end of the paragraph is that lots of people, especially older people, and some of them quite expert, have very negative viewpoints about this new phenomenon. Okay, and Stephen Fry is put in there as a kind of epitome of somebody who is very highly intelligent and knows his onions, especially on language. So he's there as a kind of expert opinion. Okay, and it's setting up a contrast between older people and younger people, suggesting that, uptalk is maybe an aspect of generational change, that it's actually just younger people who are using it. And that's why older people who don't like these younger forms, they are disapproving of it. But the question of how even the UK was infected with this speech pattern has never been adequately answered. So this links back to the idea of the genuine linguistic mystery. What word in there grabs your attention? Well, it may be this passive voice use of infected. Okay, so this links in again very nicely with Jean Aitchison, doesn't it? Remember Jean Aitchison with her 3 metaphors for people's anxieties about language change? We've got the damp spoon syndrome we mentioned earlier, we've got the crumbling castle, and we've got the infectious disease. So here we've got the notion of the infectious disease, and here it's used as the passive voice. So we've got our poor old country, the whole UK, is apparently infected with this speech pattern. So it's a pejorative representation of the effects of this kind of language change. Okay, so I hope I've shown to you some of the features there about phonological change over time, and stress that, this is not an area that is neutral, that people often have very strong, heated feelings about other people's phonological features. Thank you.